It's my pleasure to introduce to you Cassandra Willard. She is the course director at Full Sail University, and she's our resident media law expert for the moment. So it's our pleasure to have you here with us. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much, Eric. I appreciate the invitation.
Um, I wanted to start off by asking maybe a general question of how do you see social media changing the way that we think about media law today?
Social media has had a huge impact and change. You've seen a tremendous amount of information about social media on the news just within the past 10 days. I know my students at Full Sail have been discussing the fact that they've seen Zuckerberg more on C-SPAN than they ever thought they would. So we're constantly seeing an evolution. One of the great things about technology is it's always pushing the boundaries on the law. It's part of the reason why when I was in law school, one of my focus areas was technology. Now, granted, I've been practicing law for a really long time. So with that being said, I was leaving school when Napster was starting to blow up. So it's been a little bit, but it was an exciting time to be there because people were just starting to see what the mobility could do, and having the honor of being able to see Derek Sivers from CD Baby talk about his new concept, and sitting in between somebody from the RIAA and the MPAA and have the MPAA rep say that infringement is something that only the recording industry would have to deal with online because files are too big. It's been really cool to see the evolution over time. So right now we're in a really interesting spot because we have the FCC, we have Congress, and we have the courts all weighing in on how this technology should work and function for us. And when it comes to social media, part of it is us applying what we already know. So we look at intellectual property law and some of our privacy rights and publicity right cases and things like that. But then we also are going to tie in new technology because there are things that we don't realize you can do on social media until you do them. So we have a concept of the idea of selling information as an example, but until it becomes a large scale issue, we're not really going to hone in and look at social media as being a thorn in the side. We look at more traditional formats. So we're really seeing how what we do brick and mortar translates into that digital world, which makes it a cool time to practice law.
And a really confusing time to figure out how to apply those brick and mortar statutes to something that exists everywhere at all times and has no rules that we've clearly defined yet.
Absolutely. It's kind of like plate tectonics. We're trying to figure out where all the lands are going to stop moving. So,
Well, when you mentioned Napster, makes me think of as you started to talk about the idea of copyright, and this is something that maybe formerly only professional artists or musicians really had to worry about, and now it's something that everybody in their daily media usage has to start considering. And I know you've spoken extensively about copyright issues in the past. First of all, what what deems something copyrighted? I know that's often an unclear area for people even who are professional. I'm a professional artist and I work with a lot of professional artists, and they often don't know when their work is copyrighted.
yeah, when it comes to copyright, there is a discussion of copyright is born when the work is born. So when you have a completed project, there's this like magical moment, there's like glitter sound in the background or something, and poof, a copyright exists. That copyright is something that's deemed to be a common law copyright. That copyright is just you attaching as an author to a work. It's not enough to be able to enforce your actual right. It's part of the reason I always recommend to students, to artists, to educators, to anybody who's creating content that you can hold and owns rights to think about the fact that copyright is good right now for your life plus 7 decades. Congress is also discussing and debating that, so stay tuned for possible updates. But the cost of a copyright is 65 bucks, give or take, depending on how you register. And in all seriousness, it makes a really good holiday gift because there's nothing else that somebody's going to give you that's good for your life plus 7 decades, let alone something that's less than 70 bucks. So it's a really good investment to be able to register your work. I always recommend to my students and alumni to register their portfolio work as long as their pieces are all original, which for portfolio work, original pieces should be kind of a cornerstone concept. So making sure that those portfolio pieces that you make that are original are being forwarded to potential employers, to potential clients in a way that they're protected. So if, hopefully it doesn't happen, a portfolio piece gets mobilized and misused, you don't have to have that lag time of registering your copyright before you can actually pursue a claim. To be able to enforce a right, if you're not registered, there's definitely a delay that occurs, and that can impact the money that you could receive for that infringement claim. So it's worthwhile to go through and register copyright. To put the Sienna circle symbol on it, the year and your name is not enough to be able to actually have an enforceable copyright.
So what is the point of even calling it a common law copyright that seems to hold no water whatsoever except in our imaginations?
Copyright law has only existed, and I use the term only loosely, it's only existed for about 110 years. So what you created prior to that, you would have a copyright in existence, and then it was actually codified so you could have the enforceable right to be able to protect. So that concept of common law copyright is the space between the Constitution and the statutory regulation and the process being put into place.
Gotcha. As we start to use these new media that now we're pulling images from all over the place, is there a proper way to cite things? Oftentimes we'll just grab a meme or grab an image and share it, and could we be liable for copyright infringement just by sharing a photo?
You definitely can be responsible for anything that you would share as well as anything that you would post. When it comes to posting content, I always draw attention to Federal Trade Commission and similar regulations dealing with advertising content most commonly. I did a talk at one of the local blogging conferences about the best tips for FTC regulations and highlighted missteps that every Kardashian had made within the past month and a half or so, dealing with advertising regulations, placing brands, not putting proper sponsorship tags, etc. But when it comes to copyright, you have to be concerned about the original artist. And probably one of our most famous examples is the Ferry case dealing with the Obama Hope poster. Most people are familiar with that Hope poster and the fact that the artist basically created a visual image on top of an Associated Press existing image. That Associated Press photographer held a copyright in that image. There was that design placed over it, and there was a settlement that was made with the artist, with the Associated Press, where the AP was leaning in on their copyright of their photo and looking at protecting that right. So you want to be really cautious, especially if you're entering into the creative space. Working with a lot of creative artists in my practice, I serve as the chair-elect for the Entertainment Arts Sports Law section of the Florida Bar. So I work with a lot of artists. You always want to think about how you would feel if somebody else used your creative stuff. So as an artist trying to monetize, trying to distribute, trying to get your information out there, every artist has a different perspective. And I know earlier today I was having a discussion with somebody about the fact that the song Happy Birthday was protected under copyright for a number of decades. And the other individual said, well, that's not fair. It shouldn't be allowed to be under copyright because everybody uses it at least once a year. Now, if you're the copyright creator, you may or may not want to give up that copyright because everybody uses it at least once a year. So you can monetize that and really leverage that for commercial success. So it's up to the individual copyright holder. One of my biggest recommendations, and a client of mine was just struggling with this a couple weeks ago, wanting to use imagery from third-party sources to be able to build some copy for one of his new incoming clients. And one of the recommendations I made to him was reach out and lean into those other brands, which to him was the foreign concept. He's like, oh my gosh, if I tell them what I'm doing, what if they tell me no? What about this? What about that? He went ahead and took the advice, which was a good thing, and leaned out and reached out to the first brand, and I worked with him. And the first brand came back and said, this is fantastic. You're expanding us into a market we've never reached. This is an amazing opportunity, and this gives us a great way to kind of cross-promote. And we're going to send you images that'll meet your needs, and you need to tag us and give us the right to repost and to forward on some of the things that you create. So it was a really great synergy. So you want to be careful, because if somebody took your stuff and used it in a negative light, or somebody took your stuff and converted and monetized on it, you wouldn't be super happy. And you have certain platforms, YouTube being the biggest one right now, that it has a system similar to the educational platform Turnitin or some of the other
Yeah.
plagiarism software checkers. And they're very fluent at being able to find things, especially even if they've started to be altered. Those platforms are trying to find things more easily. So my rule of thumb is always be famous before you're infamous. So make sure you get permissions before you go through and distribute anything. It'll save you in the long haul.
It makes the example that I thought of when you were talking was when it could go the other direction and it doesn't work out so well. And the famous Ice Ice Baby, where they
Yeah.
Vanilla Ice took Queen's bass line from
Yes.
Pressure and said that by adding the one beat instead of dun 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 dun, it was dun 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 dun, and he said that constituted sufficient change
Yeah.
to make it an original work. Which
Mm-hmm.
brings me to my next question, which is, I know with music there are certain kind of hard and fast parameters that, a certain amount of time has to be exerted or a certain percentage of the piece has to be changed in order to it to be considered an original work. But it gets a little really tricky, I think, with images, because how do you deem what a certain percentage of an image is? Are there precedents or guidelines for that sort of thing?
We actually don't have any set number frame in place for any of our types of creative works.
Hmm.
There's always been this misnomer that a certain number of bars or a
Hmm.
certain number of seconds of music gets a pass or a buy. And I know the visual artists I work with, this is a point of frustration. And I always use the analogy of think about coming into your classroom every single day for the span of a term. You're probably not wearing the exact same thing from head to toe, but students probably still recognize you,
Hmm.
even though you have on a different shirt, different pants. So, like 70% maybe of your look at minimum is totally different, but they can still recognize you.
Mm-hmm.
It's a good way to think about the way copyright works. For copyright, we're looking at the substantiality of the quality of the content that's being copywritten.
Hmm.
Another way to think about it, it's the recognizability. And we recently have had a music case that was looking at 3 notes that were looped in a way. And the court said those 3 notes are distinctive enough that that's going to be infringement. So the rule of thumb of how much it could or couldn't be is kind of being set off to the side.
Hmm.
And now we're looking at how recognizable it would be. It's part of the reason why some of those parody movies are actually brought out by the film houses who own the films that they're making fun of, because they're taking content they already own and just borrowing it over into the comedy that they're making. And we have some really great visual art cases. I know it's an older case, but if you or any of your students are fans of Robin Williams had a film Moscow on the Hudson, and the poster totally infringing. Movie totally funny, but the poster was the advertisement, and that poster had infringement in it. And the argument was made that it was a fair use exception because the movie was parody, but ultimately you still had the issue. Hangover 2 had an artwork issue dealing with the face tattoo, one of our other more recent visual art cases. We have a lot of cases dealing with visual arts that'll come into play, and our courts will always look at recognizability. So if I see something and it harkens to some other piece of artwork or it's a small change, whatever it would be, it's still going to be the basis for an infringement claim potentially.
So how would a cover song or appropriation art play into this? I mean, I know Richard Prince is an artist who blatantly takes people's artwork all the time, and he has gotten sued plenty of times for it. But even
Yeah,
someone
Prince versus
covering on American
Carousel.
Idol or something.
Yeah, Prince versus Carousel is one of the big cases in visual arts, actually, with his artwork with the Rastafarians that ended up going through the court. And originally it was deemed to be something that was accepted, and then it went through the appeals courts, and they said there wasn't enough of a creative step. It wasn't transformative.
Yeah.
So we're always looking to see if that work is something that has novelty, if it's transformative, or if it's something that's just riding on the coattails or utilizing and leveraging the existing copyright. Because again, we want to protect the artist. So we want to protect the artist and the creative work that initially has existed, because it's not fair to them to lose everything they had otherwise for somebody who is using their stuff. It's why, as a recording artist, for sound recordings, we have a few different ways where you can license music and get rights to be able to make reproductions and things like that. When it comes to visual arts, you're having dialogue with the owner of that work to be able to see what rights are given up or what rights are being retained.
Um, when we talk about using this work and taking this work, it starts to begin to take on a whole other issue when we then consider, is this work even true? Or is it, for example, uh, President Trump has gotten in trouble numerous times about retweeting something that turns out to be libelous or false.
Yeah.
Um, and so, in quoting somebody or in retweeting somebody, I know the old school is school of thought, the brick and mortar school of thought, if you will, is if you're republishing something, you're just as culpable for the truth of that content as the original publisher is. Um,
Absolutely.
how does that play into the social media realm?
The social media realm, you see a similar translation. And ultimately, we're looking at the fact that as you rebroadcasting content, you are becoming a publisher as well.
Hmm.
So if you're participating in spreading that information, you become a source for that data too. So here in Central Florida, we actually had a pretty serious claim. It's been about a decade ago now. It's been a while. When we had the Trayvon Martin shooting down here, that was a huge impact for us in Central Florida, and George Zimmerman went to trial. And Spike Lee was not happy about what had happened. And Spike Lee tweeted an address for a George Zimmerman in Seminole County, Florida, not the George Zimmerman in Seminole County, Florida. So a family ended up having damage done to their home, having all sorts of issues. They reached out to Lee and said, this is completely unacceptable. They ended up settling a claim. A couple of years later, they ended up incurring issues again. So their attorney reached back out to Lee's camp, and Lee's camp said, whoa, 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 we already took care of everything from when this was an issue a couple of years ago. And the attorney pushed back and said, wait, time out. These are people who are using that history, like programs like Time Hop. They're looking back and saying, hey, remember 2 years ago when Spike Lee told us to go over here to this address? And they're reposting it, and people are then being re-energized.
Oh, wow.
Because Zimmerman was acquitted, and people in Orlando had mixed feelings. So people were being re-energized to take some sort of a charge and try and lay a claim of sorts. So the family was being attacked again, and the family said, you're responsible. This is ultimately your tweet, because the only thing Lee did was take it down after as part of the settlement, but there was nothing that he did to completely steal it off from Twitter. So it was still in that distribution channel. It's part of the reason why you see our news media being so diligent to confirm and reconfirm information. The recent celebrity deaths that we've had, you see a lot of our news media saying cause of death unknown, we're waiting on the autopsy, because they don't want to publish something false with a celebrity and then have 15 other places cite them as the source. Everybody takes liability, but that root source decidedly doesn't want to have risk either.
Which has to be a really challenging operation as a PR department, to be thinking that not only are you responsible for damage control on things that are happening right now, but also anachronistically something that was done months ago could come back and become live again, and things don't really disappear.
Absolutely.
Are there any safeguards that you would recommend for someone, even if they're just a regular user of social media, or if they're doing this for their profession, any safeguards you would recommend to just make sure that they're sort of following the best practices to avoid getting in hot water?
Absolutely. As a journalist, anything that you have time to be able to research and confirm that's not time sensitive, absolutely take the time to confirm. When you deal with a celebrity's passing, as an example, you see some news media sources that will dive on it right away. Some of our gossip pages will report that somebody has passed away before they're even finished closing ambulance doors, it feels like. Other sources are going to wait up to 16 to 20 hours to go through. We have a few of our major news sources that will be the last to report and say, well, 25 other sources have said it, so yep, that person passed away. But the avoid the issue, and I'll never personally forget, I was watching news media one Sunday morning, and Joe Paterno passed away, from Penn State, the football coach. And I'm sitting there drinking my cup of coffee, and I'm watching one of the big network morning shows. And they dive in, break in during a segment, and they say, Joe Paterno has passed away. Our heart is breaking for the family. They go to commercial. They come back from commercial, and the host is white as a ghost and looks nauseated. And he said, we just want to wish all the best to Joe Paterno and his family. We wish him all the luck in the world for his continued fight.
Yeah.
because he's still continuing that fight. Joe Paterno died within the hour. So this poor news host had to come back on during the same 1 hour segment and say, we've triple confirmed this. We swear he's passed away. Our hearts are breaking. We don't even know what to do. Whereas a number of other networks were like, we're not going to go near this until we can triple confirm. So that's part of it. Now, the flip side is if it's something that's breaking news, and again, I'll use Orlando as an example. I'm based here in the state of Florida in Orlando. I got up to go to work actually at the institution where I teach the morning that the Pulse shooting happened. We actually were hosting an open house that day. So I was getting ready to go to work. I got up that morning, I looked at my social media, and I saw hashtag Pray for Orlando was trending. And I knew the night before that there had been an artist who was killed, a former Voice contestant who was killed at a smaller venue in town. And it was odd to me of why in the world 24-ish hours later would Pray for Orlando come into play with what had happened the night before. It seemed like kind of a weird lag to me. Granted, it was like 4:30 in the morning. But I'm scrolling through my information on my social media, and I saw that there was a shooting at the Pulse nightclub here in Central Florida. And when I turned on the news, they said that they estimated 20 people had died. They were debating if there was a secondary shooter, and they were talking about all sorts of info. People went onto their social media, and some of them were private individuals, some of them were news sources. And one of the news sources told people that they thought that the shooter had left the club and had gone to the closest hospital, or that there was a second shooter, which caused mass panic. Another news outlet said, if you want to give blood, go to the hospital where all the survivors are being taken. So one news channel said this is where an active shooter possibly could be, or an accomplice. One said go here to get blood, and it was basically chaos. Now, when you have something like 9/11 or some other type of terror attack, active war, what's going on today, if you saw the news story in Toronto as an example with a van attack, when you have something that's unfolding, we give our media some breathing room because if nothing else, we don't want people running through the scene, coming into the scene. We want to protect our citizenry. So we're going to give some breathing room as a news source to be able to say, hey, this is the area, facts are still unfolding. But if this is a story that you have time to edit, you have time to change, we won't give you that leeway of facts are still unfolding. We're cool, we're not quite that cool. So if you remember the TV show Cops, Cops is an edited show. So with Cops, they don't have the same leeway that you would have with a news reporter standing outside of a courthouse talking about the fact that the Cosby case has finished live testimony today. So you have a little more breathing room if it's live reporting versus if something that can be edited and archived that's not time sensitive.
Yeah. So far, I think we've been talking a lot about maybe personal or individual use, but as you start to talk about media usage, in this new era of fake news and disinformation,
Yes.
what kind of legal mechanisms are there for holding organizations or people accountable on the confines of social media? Does the FTC have any purchase on this with their unfair and deceptive acts or practices rules?
Absolutely. Anything dealing with false advertising or fraud would absolutely fall in within the FTC regulation. So the FTC is going to dive in to anything that would be false or fraudulent as far as advertising, marketing, promotion, anything like that. So if a brand makes a false guarantee, something of that nature, that can be problematic. Brands can also take responsibility, or better yet, have it forced on them. If they have brand ambassadors or influencers who are told to go through and do some sort of product placement and a disclaimer isn't given. So as an example, if you notice, I have a bottle of water here. If I go through and spin the bottle brand around and show it off and say, part of the reason why it's so great to give talks on Skype is thanks to the refreshment of, and then show the brand of water. If the one brand provided me the product for free or compensated me, I would need to then explain that I was sponsored by the brand, that I had received free product, to have that transparency. Without that, it then becomes the basis of an FTC regulation because there is a risk of falsity or fraud that can occur. So we want to ensure that we're being diligent in that transparency of what's being posted. Information that's just straight up false, and I know right before I hopped on this session, I was doing some research, kind of re-upping a few different topics for another class that I'm working with. But I was looking at some of the claims dealing with defamation, because there's a defamation claim from Cosby's case that's kicking around. There are over 30 cases from our current commander-in-chief dealing with defamation that are floating around. Defamation, false light, violation of privacy rights, etc., those all apply whether it's virtual or physical. So anything that would impact your local newspaper reporter is going to impact you just the same if you're posting it online. So you really have to think about that translation between the two. The fact that it's posted on the internet doesn't give you a pass. So whether you are a business or an individual, you want to make sure you're being diligent at the content that you're distributing throughout.
Now, what I'm about to ask may become a moot point in a week or so. If someone's watching this in a future semester, they can perhaps just ignore this. But with the whole...
Just give me a leave to plug in while I listen to the question.
Sure. With the whole net neutrality up in the air, I know there's concern that perhaps the FTC and other organizations that are now becoming the police of internet usage could become so overwhelmed and overburdened and stretched thin. Do you see that having an effect on maybe how all of this is regulated and monitored?
It definitely can have an impact, because by going through and now having different brands participating, having access being potentially compromised, having all sorts of different platforms that are now weighing in and looking at how much data that they're consuming or how we're actually going through as individual users and accessing data, this becomes a big discussion. And if you've seen any of the net neutrality storylines, I know initially I was actually at my office in my firm at the time that the story came through, and one of my assistants came in and said, oh my gosh, this is such a horrible negative impact, because now streaming is no longer going to be a thing because of the data consumption that comes from streaming. Some of my clients who are bloggers definitely were upset, because as a video blogger, I'm creating content that needs rich data distribution, that needs a lot of support. So you definitely have some different channels that are playing in this space. One important thing to note, all of our media distribution channels that are going to be heavily affected by this, also a lot of them are big players. So when you see a generation coming through of cord cutters, and having worked with some major communication companies with different conferences, our big media communication companies have started to go through and diversify. You have communication companies that used to be by our cable services, now leaning in on over-the-top services and some other formats, so they can go through and get access. For them to see different regulatory spaces that could crunch down on their market, they're now motivated to go through and push back on different sources. So you have the high court being able to step in and have some regulatory action. You have our executive branch as well as our legislative branch going through and being able to lean into. So this is one of the issues, and I don't know if it's the same in your geographic area, but definitely in my geographic area, this is an area where some of our younger candidates are really pushing forward and saying these are concerns that we have, and these are things that we want to talk about when we get to DC. So this has become a plank in a campaign, whereas 25 years ago, when individuals were running for election, never in a million years would they talk about new media content or anything of that nature. So it's cool to see the evolution.
With, is there, I'm trying to think how to phrase the question, with the news media trying to make sense of how to go about its due diligence online, is there any new considerations in terms of how to balance the people's right to know with their right to privacy, especially now that we're signing away all of our privacy on social media? Does that make the waters any murkier, or is it still kind of par for the course?
The fact that so many users on social media have this faith that the use of social media is the most important focus, we give up so much incredibly large amounts, volumes of data throughout just our daily lives and daily usage if you pay close attention. This is actually a process I utilized this morning. I was doing a lecture on our campus at Full Sail, and I had my students take out their phones and pull up one of their social media apps and look to see under the settings or whatever the equivalent would be on other devices, look to see what those apps were actually pulling. And a lot of them were amazed because some of their social media apps had their microphone open. Some of their social media apps were tracking 70 other apps. The transparency dealing with Facebook in particular, because of Zuckerberg on C-SPAN recently, you've seen a lot of news networks talking about everything that Facebook can reach into and all the places where we give them consent. So you can go through, search online, and you can find a way to figure out what apps you're giving that translatability to with Zuckerberg. And you can actually go through and shut down Facebook's availability to get a lot of that information. You can also close your photos, you can close your microphone, but when you download apps, notoriously, they are going to want as much information as they can possibly gather. Because if they can get geography and data and all sorts of great things, this is super helpful. There's a fascinating story, I believe it was the BBC, earlier this year, one of their reporters joined a dating website merely to study data collection. And he was only on the page, I want to say, for 3 or 4 weeks. And by the time he was finished, they had hundreds of pages of data. They knew where he went, they knew where he spent money, they knew what he did. So not only do they have the information that he gave up, and the story was really interesting because he said, I knew I put a profile picture up. I knew I put, whatever biographical data. I kind of in my head likened it to LinkedIn, sort of you put a picture and you put a bio and you put, whatever is important to you kind of thing, and important for other people to know. But you don't think about, they track my geography, they track if you utilize your device to be able to pay, you had translatability. So the app was then figuring out, where do you spend money, how do you spend money using your device. It was tracking where the person lingered geographically. It was gathering a tremendous amount of information that the reporter had no idea he was actually unloading onto it. So I think one of the trends we're starting to see, and after the appearance of Facebook founder Zuckerberg on C-SPAN, you do see more folks looking at that privacy policy, which is a nice thing to be able to see. When you look at social media platforms, a lot of your terms of use and privacy policies are actually longer than the U.S. Constitution. So if you print out the Constitution, you print out the privacy policy is longer, which is terrifying. But we give a lot of information, but there's this perception that if I'm not on whatever the platform is, it's that fear of missing out kind of that comes into play. So there's a lot of transferability of information, and then the companies are using that because information is money at this point. So for them to be able to leverage and sell that information, it's a way for them to monetize. So as users, we've got to be more savvy in this space and think about how to leverage it. Now, with that being said, I have some friends who do analytics and sell and buy data from all sorts of different platforms, and they love it because as a user, we're the ones who are using it because we feel like we have to, but we're the ones who are creating all this rich data for them to be able to go back and sell. When did I scroll back and what did I like and what did I comment on, and go through and take all of that otherwise private information and publish it broadly.
It kind of brings me back to that question of unfair and deceptive acts or practices. Is there some sort of culpability for Facebook to make these things less opaque, to make them shorter than the Constitution, perhaps?
Yeah, I think for them, the reason why they have so much depth is there are so many different functionality items. If it were more of a streamlined process, it would be a streamlined agreement. But as we add more features and functionality, we're going to see that diversify and expand over time. So I liken it, if you use a platform that has streaming content as an example, a lot of our streaming websites, particularly those who moved into that space, I was talking about the platform Netflix just last week. Netflix started out as that replacement for the physical disc that Blockbuster used to have. Then they moved into the space of streaming. Their terms of use and privacy policy massively altered when they moved into the streaming space, because when I order a disc, all you have is when did you throw it in the mailbox and when did I throw it back to you. Whereas with streaming, you can figure out that at 2:35 in the morning on Saturday morning, I was searching for this, but I decided to watch that. I watched 15 minutes of it and I didn't log back in for another 8 hours. So you're getting so much more information other than I've had a disc sitting on my credenza for about 15 days because I've been working and traveling. It's not the same rich data as looking at my phone and seeing that I'm sitting in a medical facility at 2 o'clock in the afternoon and I'm watching something with a low volume. So clearly I must be waiting either for my own or somebody else's doctor's appointment. So there's a lot more information, and that's why they extend out those agreements. I always like to point out the fact AOL, when they were brand new, their user agreement was only about 8 pages because they didn't know everything it could do. And then when the Americans all started to get online, then AOL started to figure out you can use the platform to say mean, nasty, false things about people. You can use the platform to say mean, nasty things about business. You can use the platform to rebroadcast content that's not yours. You can use the platform to solicit things that you shouldn't. You can use the platform to do all sorts of illegal stuff. And that's where they started adding, which is where you get the volume of the agreement. But you do absolutely see a cry from brands of, can you give us like a top 5? Like, can you give us best practices? Or can you let us know things to watch for? Now, ultimately, as a brand, do I really want to let users know, here are the 5 ways that we get the least value out of you as a user? Right. So some of the brands have a little hesitation about fully embracing this cause right now.
Well, and we are constantly playing catch up with ourselves and figuring out what the potentials of the media that we create are, which I think brings me to the question I want to close with, which is, do you think that media law is keeping pace with the technology, or do you think the change in media is outstripping the change in the law, trying to keep up with it? And where do you think it needs to go in the future? Is there some other alternative we need to be embracing?
Right now, I think the best answer is it's doing the best it can. The way that the process works within our legislature as well as within our judiciary, there is a time-like process. If there weren't a time-like process, you wouldn't see our courts having people waiting for years and years and years. You wouldn't see the Cosby case going to closing arguments tomorrow after you saw charges being filed years prior, et cetera. So I think we're doing as well as we can with the way we typically will handle items. And you see this with a lot of things the news media is discussing right now when it comes to topics like gun control, as an example. You see a lot of discussion, you see marches, you see discussion with Time's Up movement, etc. It's how we actually convert that into something that is now applicable that we can push forward with. I think we're starting to identify things more quickly, which is encouraging to be able to go through and say, hey, maybe it's not right that they know all of my financial transactions when it's a social media page or something of that nature. So I think there's more awareness and transparency with the help of our media pointing out, hey, these are things you need to know. But when it comes to our judiciary, some of our judges are a little bit more senior, not that they're not hip and trendy, but they're not necessarily living and breathing by their devices. So we do have a bit of a learning curve here. Same thing with our legislature. So when we had legislature, we had one congressman in particular who kept asking about a certain app, if you saw this story at all, dealing with Zuckerberg, and was trying to figure out how the app functioned. And it's something that my students were just completely infatuated with, of like, how does this guy not know how WhatsApp works? Like, everybody knows how WhatsApp works. But it's something where you're starting to see our judiciary and legislature trying to get up to speed. And when it comes to our Supreme Court, the composition of the court has started to evolve over the past decade. And although we have some younger justices, we don't have justices that are quite as fluent when it comes to technology and journalism as some of the justices that were being replaced. So for me, practicing solely entertainment and art and sports, it was kind of a punch in the gut because I love our new justices. They're all fantastic. But we had justices who were going through and really looking at First Amendment, at media, at broadcast, at journalism. Now we have a group that needs to see how does this translate across. And one of my favorite media cases, and it really showcased how some of our newer justices can weigh in, but they're taking brick and mortar and translating it to show you how this interplays. We had a case that originated with Schwarzenegger dealing with violence in video games. fascinating case. And Arnold Schwarzenegger, as the governor of California, was suing the video game industry based on video game violence that he felt was inappropriate and was causing society to be a much more violent place. Ignore the fact he was the Terminator. It makes this so much easier. So it goes all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. Governor Brown had taken over by the time it went to the U.S. Supreme Court. And for oral arguments, the Supreme Court justices started pulling out examples of concerns they had because if video games were too violent, what about the cartoons we watch as kids? Mm-hmm. So our Supreme Court started going to media they were familiar with. So they were talking about Looney Tunes and the Acme Corporation and everything that they do. They were talking about fairy tales because these are things they're used to. They can't speak fluently about God of War or any other, Mortal Kombat, etc. But they can talk about Looney Tunes. They can talk about Grimm's fairy tales. They can talk about some of the other categories that is within their lexicon very easily to be able to share. So it's interesting to see our courts starting to see cases where they have to deal with digital media or even international market media dealing with technology. And they're like Bambi, that scene where Bambi's on ice, where they're kind of figuring out how the legs work. And they're trying to sort through and figure out, how does copyright really translate? When are we in a space of infringement? When are we in a space where maybe the fair use defense will work? So they're trying to sort through these different locations. And with the Prince versus Carousel case, you mentioned the artist earlier, that case was an interesting case because you had one judge weigh in and say, well, gosh darn it, there were some changes and that should be good enough. Whereas another judge looked at it and said, wait a second, this is completely different. And I used as one of my course examples, example from an episode of South Park that actually survived the fair use test. And it's something that's fascinating to my students. If for no other reason, you had 3 appellate court justices, all of whom were in their late 40s to early 60s, watching an episode of South Park and watching an EDM music video from overseas. So if nothing else, that makes for good storytelling. So we're starting to see our judiciary really looking at technology more. It's here to stay. When I was first studying at law school, it was this weird double dutch of, we think yellow pages and phone books are going to stick around, because never in a million years did we think that we would be running around with computers in our back pocket and watching content as if it were being broadcast via antenna on terrestrial television on a transient device that we could use anywhere. So we're starting to see that tech move so quickly, and our laws are now kind of chasing behind it. So you will have a lag. You see it in some of the states right now. My local jurisdiction, you're not allowed to text and drive, but everything else is okay. So technically, the way our statute reads, you can actually utilize other platforms.
I wasn't texting, I was WhatsApping.
Yeah, exactly. I can go ahead and do a live feed while I'm driving, but I can't text. So a lot of our jurisdictions are trying to hustle and figure out what's that next step, because they want to be ahead of the curve. But technology, it's the beautiful thing about technology. Technology is pushing us to move ever forward. So as the technology advances, you then start seeing rules and regulations that will be integrated into that. And I just recently was interviewed related to AI and how artificial intelligence is impacting different things that we do. And there's this perception of like Brave New World kind of with AI. But ultimately, it's all the great things that AI can really integrate into. And our courts and our legislature are constantly looking to see, how can we use it proactively in a good way? What do we do now, brick and mortar, that we can transfer traditionally? And then what do we need to look to that's completely innovative that we haven't thought of yet? So we've got to look at that and figure out where that best space will be. And sometimes it's like the Pokemon Go app. We figure it out once we're already up to our eyeballs in it. And sometimes we can be a little proactive with it and look at copyright and say, hey guys, you really should have known this was a bad idea or a good idea kind of deal.
Well, before I let you go, are there any resources you would recommend if students want a more accessible entry point into media law? I know my students have access to the AP style books briefing on media law. Is there anything else that you would recommend?
Absolutely. One of the authors that I love to follow, and she just published a cyber law book about a year and a half ago. It's more current than some of the other media sources. that I've seen recently is Joy Butler. Her first name is Joy, the last name is Butler, Butler. She's an IP attorney based out of DC, and I've utilized her Permission Seekers Guidebook for a number of years, and it's a great resource as well. Half of it is protecting what you make, half of it is going through and clearing what you would need. And it has sample agreements in it that, even though they're very basic, they definitely can give you some direction at least. And she created a kind of a sister book to that guide called the Cyber Citizens Guide through the Legal Jungle. And the Cyber Citizens Guide gives you a lot of information about digital media and media as a whole. If you'd like, you can also send me an email and I can send you a couple of resources that I use just to be able to keep current too.
Great. Well, thank you so much. This has been a pleasure. We really appreciate you lending your expertise. So thank you very much for being with us.
You're so welcome. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Anytime. Take care.
Have a great night.
You too.